Look at Iran today, and you see a nation buckling under severe domestic crises. Annual inflation hovers between 42 and 58%, while aggressive overextraction has pushed the country into extreme water stress, draining once massive lakes into cracked, arid basins. Yet in that exact same timeframe, the Islamic Republic has spent over $20 billion to arm and train proxy forces across the Middle East, supplying advanced munitions and logistical support to groups thousands of miles from its borders. This presents a severe contradiction. How does a heavily sanctioned nation, and capable of stabilizing its own currency or water supply, consistently finance a highly coordinated, multi-front regional war? The answer requires discarding the traditional Western concept of a military. If you analyze the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, simply as an armed force, the math will never align. The IRGC operates as a massive macroeconomic conglomerate that has built a parallel state architecture. It is explicitly designed to extract wealth from the Iranian domestic economy and channel it directly into ideological and military objectives abroad. For the regime, managing a functional civilian economy is a secondary concern. The economic survival of the Iranian population is completely subordinate to the financial requirements of its proxy networks. This structure was built by design following the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The ruling clerics deeply distrusted the traditional Iranian regular army, the Artesh, fearing it retained loyalties to the deposed Shah. To protect their revolution, they formed the IRGC. From its inception, the Guard was indoctrinated with a strict ideology rooted in religious eschatology and the concept of perpetual mobilization, or jihad. Sustaining a continuous revolution requires vast, unrestricted capital. A standard civilian government budget, subject to public scrutiny and domestic needs, cannot legally or practically provide the level of funding required for covert proxy warfare. To bypass these limits, the IRGC systematically spawned parallel institutions. Over decades, it built its own distinct networks across the military, political, and economic domains, expanding into a parallel structure that physically and financially dwarfs the traditional Iranian state. Because the organization's existence relies on continuous territorial and ideological expansion, achieving complete financial independence from the civilian state is a structural necessity. The IRGC's capture of the domestic economy began shortly after the Iran-Iraq War, rapidly accelerating under the guise of national reconstruction and policies aimed at creating a self-reliant resistance economy. At the center of this expansion is Khatam al-Anbiya, the IRGC's primary engineering and construction conglomerate. Khatam al-Anbiya operates as an unchecked monopoly. It regularly secures billion-dollar no-bid government contracts to build the country's critical infrastructure, including pipelines, roads, and dams. Through these dam and diversion projects, the IRGC effectively functions as a water mafia. They dictate Iran's water management policy, deliberately prioritizing water diversion for politically connected industrial enterprises rather than public agricultural needs. The ecological and social fallout in rural regions has been devastating. By prioritizing industrial output over environmental stability, IRGC infrastructure projects have contributed heavily to the shrinking of vital water reserves, including Lake Urmia, which has lost over 80% of its volume. This extraction extends to the food supply. Through a network of parastatal foundations known as bonyads, the IRGC manages vast agricultural resources and distribution networks, monopolizing the domestic supply chain for essential commodities. By controlling the flow of local goods, the Guard can manipulate markets and withhold supply. This systemic monopolization directly exacerbates severe food inflation for ordinary citizens, while generating massive, untaxed revenue for IRGC leadership. The baseline funding model of the IRGC is inherently extractive. It deliberately cannibalizes Iran's critical infrastructure and resources to feed its own institutional wealth. But extracting domestic wealth in Iranian rials is insufficient. To purchase advanced weaponry and fund international proxy militias, the IRGC requires massive reserves of hard foreign currency. For decades, oil exports provided this currency. But the imposition of international banking restrictions and U.S. maximum pressure sanctions severely restricted traditional assets, triggering a national balance of payments crisis. To survive, the IRGC pivoted. They built a heavily insulated evasion architecture by deepening economic ties with China, targeting entities deliberately disconnected from the Western financial system. This chart tracks Iranian exports of crude oil to China. Initial sanctions were severe, dropping export revenue to a record low of $6.6 billion in 2020. Yet the evasion architecture quickly adapted. By 2022, illicit revenue spiked to $30 billion. The mechanics behind this rebound rely heavily on a ghost fleet. The IRGC utilizes hundreds of unregulated illicit oil tankers that obscure their origins and transfer millions of barrels of crude oil to willing buyers. Once the oil is sold, the funds must be laundered. The IRGC has developed a secondary evasion layer using domestic cryptocurrency exchanges, such as Nobitex, to move digital assets across borders and bypass traditional banking restrictions entirely. By combining unregulated physical shipping with decentralized digital finance, the IRGC has successfully insulated its foreign revenue streams. They have rendered traditional Western sanctions highly porous. This raises a crucial logistical question. By what exact mechanism is this illicit global revenue physically converted into regional military power? The conduit is the Central Bank of Iran. While a standard central bank manages national macroeconomic stability, Iran's central bank functions explicitly as the primary financial clearinghouse for the IRGC. This graph of Iranian defense spending demonstrates that when international restrictions are eased, the windfall does not stabilize the domestic economy. Following the implementation of the JCPOA nuclear agreement, official defense spending instantly spiked by 24%. This flowchart outlines the exact trail of that money. The central bank routes foreign currency reserves directly into the IRGC's Quds force. Moving down the chain, capital moves through regional proxy banks, like Al-Bilad Islamic Bank, which finalize transfers directly to groups like Hezbollah. This capital network is highly elastic. Whenever new funds enter the system, whether through Iraqi energy waivers or the unfreezing of restricted foreign accounts, the central bank immediately diverts a portion of that liquidity to organizations like Hamas to meet urgent operational requirements. Every dollar of sanctions relief or illicit oil revenue is systematically weaponized. The state's banking apparatus ensures it is routed directly to proxy front lines. This is the complete macroeconomic model of the Islamic Republic. Domestic resource extraction feeds global evasion networks, which launder capital back through the central bank, directly sustaining regional proxy wars. Understanding this continuous loop explains why the regime absolutely refuses to implement international banking reforms, such as those demanded by the Financial Action Task Force. Adopting standard financial transparency would force the regime to audit its imports and exports. It would instantly expose and destroy the IRGC's ability to operate its shadow proxy network. For policymakers, this structural reality renders localized diplomacy or partial sanctions highly ineffective. Restricting one node simply forces the IRGC to extract harder from another. For the IRGC, the economic ruin of Iran is a perfectly acceptable cost of doing business. Generating the capital to fund continuous regional revolution remains the sole non-negotiable objective of the state.